She sold flowers to buy medicine for her grandmother, and she was called a thief in front of everyone for no reason. But her innocent gesture ended up transforming lives. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Now on with the story. The sun had not yet fully risen when Isabella opened her eyes that Thursday morning. The house was small, with walls that held more memories than paint, and the cold cement floor was a sign that the Pennsylvania winter was on its way. At 5 years old, the girl already knew that the day began early, long before other boys and girls her age woke up to watch cartoons on television or ask for breakfast. To be ready on the table, she got up slowly, trying not to make a sound. In the next room, separated only by a faded fabric curtain, her grandmother, Grandma Mary, slept with heavy, irregular breathing. The sound of that hoarse cough, which sometimes came in the middle of the night, was something Isabella knew all too well. The girl knew her grandma needed expensive medicines, the kind that came in little boxes with complicated names, and that her mother, Frances, went out every day in search of temporary jobs precisely to be able to pay for those boxes, in addition to the rent and the food that was never enough. Isabella walked to the backyard, a tiny space squeezed between the neighbor's wall and the peeling paint of the kitchen. There, arranged in rows on wooden planks propped up by bricks, were her treasures. Repurposed formula cans, empty margarine tubs, plastic soda bottles cut in half, and a few cracked clay pots she had found in the trash at the local farmer's market. Inside each of these makeshift containers, flowers were growing. They weren't perfect roses or sophisticated orchids like the ones she saw in the windows of the downtown florists. They were simple but vibrant flowers: tiny daisies, carnations of various colors, pink geraniums, purple violets, and a few succulents that sprouted with admirable stubbornness, despite being planted in so little space and with so little soil. The idea had been born months earlier, when Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor who lived 3 houses down, had given Isabella a small bag of seeds. The old woman, who could no longer tend to her own garden because of her back pain, said that those seeds couldn't be left to die in a drawer. Isabella accepted the gift with shining eyes and ran to show her grandmother. Grandma Mary, though ill, taught her granddaughter how to prepare the soil, mixing the little bit they had with dry leaves and vegetable peels. She also taught her that a plant needs 3 things: good soil, the right amount of water, and affection every day. And that's how it began. Isabella started collecting seeds from flowers she saw falling on the ground, rescued small seedlings that the market vendors threw away at the end of the day, and asked her mother to save any empty container that appeared in the house. With the patience of someone born knowing that good things take time to grow, the girl watered her little plants every morning, talked to them as if they were friends, and celebrated each new leaf that sprouted as if it were a miracle. When the first flowers bloomed, Grandma Mary suggested in a weak but hopeful voice that Isabella could try to sell some. At first the girl found it strange. How would someone pay for such simple flowers, planted in old cans? But her grandmother explained that beauty isn't in the size of the pot, but in the color of the petal and the scent it exudes. She also said a phrase that Isabella never forgot: beauty also feeds the soul, and sometimes, my child, people need a colorful smile more than warm bread. It was then that Isabella started going out every morning with a cardboard box in her hands. Inside it, she carefully arranged her small bouquets. Each little flower was chosen with care, and the girl made sure to tie the small stems with colorful strings that she painted herself with poster paint from school. Before leaving, her grandmother always said the same words like a blessing. Remember, my little one, a flower is a hug in the form of a petal, and kindness blossoms where you least expect it. Isabella would repeat these phrases in a low voice as she walked through the streets of the Hopes Crossing neighborhood, on the outskirts of Philadelphia, with the box balanced in her thin arms and her school uniform already on so as not to waste time later. The destination Isabella chose every morning was not by chance. After trying to sell in her own neighborhood and realizing that almost no one had money to spare for flowers, the girl decided to go where people seemed to have more. She would take 2 buses, using the school bus pass her mother got from the city, and get off in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood, one of the most affluent areas in Philadelphia. There, the streets were wide, tree-lined and clean. The houses were enormous, surrounded by high walls and automatic gates. The cars that passed by gleamed under the sun, and people walked hurriedly, always in a rush to get to some important place. Among so many mansions one stood out. It was impossible not to notice. The iron gate was incredibly high, crafted with details that looked like metal lace, and behind it stretched a garden that seemed more like a painting. There were impeccably designed flower beds, full of exotic flowers, trees pruned into perfect geometric shapes, and a lawn so green and uniform it looked artificial. The house itself was imposing, with 3 floors, wide balconies, and enormous glass windows that reflected the sky. Everything there breathed luxury, order, and an almost intimidating perfection. Isabella would stop on the sidewalk in front of that gate and just stand there quietly, holding her little box. She didn't shout, didn't insist, didn't run after anyone. She just stood with a sweet and hopeful gaze, waiting for someone to stop and want to take one of her flowers. Sometimes a person or two would take pity. An elderly woman walking her dog would buy a daisy and say it would brighten her day. A rideshare driver waiting for a passenger on the corner would get out of his car and take a small pot of succulents to put on his dashboard. A young woman, rushing to work, would stop for a moment, look at Isabella and buy a small bouquet of carnations, more out of a desire to help than a need for the flower. But there were days when no one stopped, days when Isabella would stand there for almost an hour, feeling the sun heat her head, her stomach rumbling because she had left home without breakfast, and she would return to the bus with her box still full. On those days, sadness would tighten her chest, but the girl didn't give up. She would come back the next day with the same hope, because she knew that at home her grandmother was waiting for her medicine, and her mother was waiting for the rent money. Inside the mansion, life moved at a completely different rhythm. The owner of the house, Robert Miller, was a well-known businessman in the city. The owner of a chain of high-end furniture stores, he had built an empire from nothing, climbing step by step to reach the top. But financial success had not been enough to fill the void that had settled in his life after Olivia, his wife, passed away. She had been the victim of a silent illness, which consumed her energy little by little, until one day she simply didn't wake up anymore. That had happened 4 years ago, but for Robert it felt like yesterday. Since then, the mansion had transformed into a museum of silence. The parties that used to happen every month, with live music, friends laughing on the balcony, and the whole house lit up, had given way to empty hallways and rooms where the furniture was always in the same place. Robert spent most of his time traveling for work, avoiding being at home for too long, because every room brought back a painful memory. The balcony where Olivia liked to have breakfast, the garden that she herself had planned, choosing each species of flower and each shrub with almost obsessive care, the bedroom where the king-size bed seemed far too large for just one person. The household staff noticed their employer's sadness, but no one dared to comment. Mrs. Rose, the cook who had worked there for 15 years, tiptoed around the kitchen, preparing meals that were often left untouched. George, the gatekeeper who controlled the entry and exit of vehicles, would spend hours at his post without seeing anyone come or go because Robert rarely had visitors. Brenda was the housekeeper who came 3 times a week to clean a house that never seemed to get truly dirty because it was hardly lived in. But there was one employee who felt especially important in that routine: Walter, the gardener. He had worked at the mansion for 7 years and considered the garden as if it were his own property. Walter was a middle-aged thin man with skin weathered by the sun and hands calloused from working with the earth. He would wake before dawn to water the plants, prune the shrubs, pull out any dry leaf that threatened the perfection of the view, and spend hours adjusting the flower beds to keep them impeccable. For him, that garden wasn't just a job. It was proof of his worth, the only thing in life he felt he completely controlled. But Walter carried an invisible weight. He was afraid of being replaced, of his boss one day deciding to hire someone younger, faster, with more modern ideas. Afraid that all his effort would not be recognized, that people would look at the garden and not realize how much sweat and dedication was there, and this fear made him suspicious, controlling, and at times cruel. He wouldn't accept anything that interfered with the order he himself had created. Not a single leaf out of place, not a single flower that wasn't chosen by him, not a single strange presence disturbing the harmony of his territory. That was why, the first time Walter saw Isabella standing on the sidewalk, with that cardboard box full of simple flowers, he felt something churn in his chest. Who was this girl? Where did those flowers come from? And, most importantly, why had she chosen this exact sidewalk, in front of the perfect garden that he maintained with such care? In Walter's mind, the answer was obvious. That girl could only be stealing flowers from the mansion's garden. There was no other explanation. Flowers of that type, similar to the ones he planted himself, couldn't have come from anywhere else. For the first few days, Walter just watched. He would hide behind the garden trees, peeking through the leaves, mentally noting the times the girl appeared. He didn't say anything to anyone, but the resentment grew inside him. This was an insult, an affront. Someone was stealing from the garden he protected with tooth and nail, and even had the audacity to resell the flowers right there in front of the house. Walter felt he needed to do something. He needed to restore order. He needed to show that no one walked all over him there. Meanwhile, Isabella continued her routine, oblivious to the angry glares she received from within the garden. She didn't know she was being watched, much less judged. To her, that enormous gate was just a landmark, a place where people passed by and might stop to buy a little flower. She couldn't imagine that on the other side of those iron bars, someone was constructing an entire narrative about her, a story in which she was the villain. One morning, Mrs. Rose was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she looked out the window and saw the girl. It was the third or fourth time she had noticed that tiny, quiet presence on the sidewalk. The cook felt her heart ache. She herself had come from a humble family, knew what it was like to have to work from a young age, and seeing that girl so young, alone, with that little box, stirred something inside her. When she finished her shift that day, Mrs. Rose went out the back door, walked around the block and approached Isabella. "My child, what are you selling there?" she asked, her voice full of tenderness. Isabella looked up, startled at first, but then offered a shy smile. "Flowers, ma'am. I grow them at home and sell them to help my mom and my grandma." Mrs. Rose felt a lump in her throat. She took out her wallet and pulled out a few coins. "Give me this little pot of violets here, will you? It will look lovely on my windowsill." Isabella handed over the small pot carefully, as if she were handing over something very precious. "Thank you, Mom, you're very kind." The cook went back inside the mansion with a heavy heart and the pot of violets in her hands. That day she mentioned the girl to George. The gatekeeper had also seen Isabella a few times, but pretended not to, because he knew Walter didn't like strangers near the property. Even so, George agreed that the situation was sad. A child so small, working like that, while on the other side of the gate there was so much of everything. The weeks went by and Isabella became a constant presence on that sidewalk. Some days were good, others not so much. But the girl didn't give up. She always returned with her shy smile, her simple flowers, and her renewed hope. For her, every person who stopped and bought a little flower was a small miracle. Proof that kindness still existed, that in the midst of so much hurry and indifference, someone still stopped to look at a child and her flowers. But inside the mansion, a storm was brewing. Walter couldn't take it anymore. He was absolutely certain that the girl was stealing the flowers, and no one was doing anything. No one seemed to care. And that made him furious. One day he decided he was going to act. He was going to put an end to it once and for all. He was going to show everyone who was in charge of that garden. He was going to put that girl in her place, and he was going to do it the way he thought was right, with firmness, with authority, leaving no room for excuses. Isabella had no idea what was about to happen. That morning, she had woken up especially excited. She had managed to save 3 new flowers that were about to bloom, and she brought them all to sell. Her grandmother had had a better night, without coughing so much, and that had filled the girl's heart with hope. Maybe things were getting better. Maybe her luck was finally turning. Maybe today would be a good day. She arrived at the sidewalk, placed her box on the ground, arranged the small pots with her usual care, and waited. The sun was warm, but the breeze was pleasant. Isabella looked up at the blue sky and thought the day was too beautiful to go wrong. She took a deep breath, smelling the scent of her own flowers mixed with the perfume of the jasmine coming from the mansion's garden, and smiled to herself. Inside the house, hidden behind a second-floor window, Walter was watching. His hands were trembling, not from fear but from contained rage. He had decided that today was the day. Today he would put an end to it. He descended the stairs with firm steps, crossed the garden without looking to either side, opened the gate with a bang that made Isabella jump in fright and walk toward her. With a grim face and clenched fists, the girl looked at him, not understanding. Her heart began to beat faster. There was something in that man's eyes that frightened her, something she had never seen before, not even on the most difficult days in her neighborhood. It was a kind of cold, calculated anger, ready to explode. Isabella took a step back, instinctively protecting her box with her body, but it was too late. Walter was there, standing in front of her, and the storm he carried inside was about to break over the head of that innocent child. The silence that fell in that instant seemed to weigh a ton. Isabella looked at Walter, unable to understand what was happening. The gardener, in turn, had his eyes fixed on the cardboard box, and his face was red, not with shame, but with a rage that had been building for days and was now exploding like a pressure cooker without a safety valve. "Where did you steal these flowers?" Walter's voice came out loud, sharp, full of accusation. He wasn't asking. He was stating, condemning, judging. Isabella took another step back, feeling her legs tremble. She tried to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. She hadn't stolen anything. Those flowers were hers, planted with her own hands, cared for with so much love in old cans in her backyard, but her voice wouldn't come out. Fear had taken over. "I know you've been coming into the garden and picking the flowers," Walter continued, pointing a finger at the girl as if she were a criminal. "Do you think I'm stupid? You think I don't see? I've been taking care of this garden for years. I know every flower, every leaf, and I know very well when someone touches what isn't theirs." Isabella finally managed to let out a thread of a voice, trembling and quiet. "I didn't steal them, sir. I grew them. I grew them all at home, with my grandma. We use old cans, and I got the seeds from Mrs. Peterson, and at the market from the things they were going to throw away." "Liar!" Walter shouted, making Isabella take another step back. "Don't try to fool me with that story, you little liar. You come here every day because you know there are quality flowers inside, so you steal them, and then sell them right in my face as if I were an idiot." The gardener was so consumed by his own narrative, so convinced of Isabella's guilt, that he couldn't see reality. To him, this girl represented everything he feared, someone trying to take advantage of the garden he protected, someone threatening the perfection he had built, someone exposing his supposed incompetence by allowing flowers to be stolen from under his nose. He wasn't really seeing Isabella. He was seeing the personification of all his fears and insecurities. Isabella tried to explain again, her eyes already filled with tears. "Sir, please. I swear I didn't steal them. Look, these flowers are different from the ones in your garden. Look at the pots, they're made of cans, of margarine tubs. Please believe me." But Walter was not willing to listen. He had decided she was guilty, and nothing the girl said would change that. Without warning, he took a step forward and, with a sudden, violent motion, kicked the cardboard box at Isabella's feet. The box flew to the side, and the small pots scattered across the sidewalk. The cans hit the ground, some denting, others rolling into the gutter. The delicate flowers were crushed. Petals broke off and blew away in the wind. Stems snapped. Soil spilled onto the asphalt. "No!" Isabella screamed, falling to her knees on the ground. She tried to gather the pieces, to pick up the flowers that were still whole, to save what could be saved. Her small hands trembled as she collected the broken stems, the crushed petals, the dented cans. "No, no, no," she repeated quietly, as if it were a prayer. Tears streamed down her face, wetting the flowers she held in her hands. Walter remained standing there, looking at the scene as if he were dispensing justice. "Now you've learned not to touch what isn't yours. Get out of here and don't come back, you hear me? If I catch you here again, I'll call the police and have you arrested for theft." Isabella didn't answer. She couldn't. All she could do was cry, kneeling on the sidewalk, trying to gather the pieces of weeks of work. Each of those flowers had been cared for with so much love. Each pot had been prepared with so much hope, and now everything was destroyed. It wasn't just the box that was broken, it was the girl's heart. It was the hope she had brought that morning. It was the faith that the world could be a good place, where kindness still existed. The entire scene was being watched. On the corner, the owner of a small market had come out to water the plants on her sidewalk and saw everything. She stood frozen, hose in hand, unsure if she should intervene. A water delivery man passing on his bicycle slowed down and stopped a few feet away, shocked by what he was seeing. A neighbor walking her dog crossed to the other side of the street, afraid to get involved. A rideshare driver who was parked waiting for a fare saw everything in his rearview mirror and felt his stomach turn, but he didn't get out of the car. No one did anything. Everyone was paralyzed between the indignation of seeing a child being humiliated and the fear of confronting an angry adult, of getting involved where they weren't wanted, of causing trouble. And so, as often happens in life, people looked away, pretended they hadn't seen, and moved on. The market owner went back inside her store. The delivery man pedaled away. The neighbor quickened her pace. The driver accepted a ride and left. Isabella was left alone, kneeling on the sidewalk, with her broken flowers and her shattered heart. Walter, satisfied with what he had done, turned his back and went back into the garden, slamming the gate shut. He was convinced he had done the right thing, that he had protected the property, that he had taught a lesson. But the truth was, he had just committed one of the greatest injustices one can commit, judging without listening, condemning without proof, destroying without mercy. Isabella remained there for what felt like an eternity. She gathered everything she could. A few flowers were miraculously still intact. She placed them carefully inside the battered box, along with the cans that hadn't been completely punctured. The rest, what was beyond repair, she left there, scattered on the sidewalk like a cemetery of broken dreams. When she finally managed to stand up, Isabella wiped her tears with the back of her hand, picked up the box, and began to walk back to the bus stop. Every step hurt. It wasn't a physical pain, it was something much worse. It was the pain of feeling wronged, of being accused of something she didn't do, of seeing her work destroyed before her eyes. And worst of all, the pain of realizing that the world isn't always fair, that adults aren't always right, and that sometimes no one will defend you, even when you are right. Inside the mansion, not everyone had missed the scene. Mrs. Rose was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard the shouts. She ran to the window that faced the front of the house and saw everything. She saw Walter kick the box, saw the girl fall to her knees, saw the flowers scatter. The cook brought a hand to her mouth, horrified. This wasn't right. None of it was right. She wanted to go out, to shout, to defend the girl, but something held her back. Maybe it was the fear of confronting Walter, who had a difficult temper. Maybe it was the fear of losing her job, of getting into trouble. Maybe it was simply the shock of seeing such cruelty happen so close. When Walter came back inside, Mrs. Rose faced him with a hard look. "Walter, what was that? What did you do to that girl?" The gardener was unfazed. "I did what had to be done. That girl was stealing flowers from the garden. I caught her red-handed." "But are you sure? Did you see her taking the flowers?" Mrs. Rose insisted, sensing something was wrong with the story. "I don't need to see, it's obvious." "Where else would she get flowers to sell?" Walter replied, with the arrogance of someone who won't admit they're wrong. "And another thing, Mrs. Rose, it's none of your business. I take care of the garden, you take care of the kitchen, everyone in their place." The cook fell silent, but inside she was seething. She knew Walter was wrong. She had seen the girl's pots, had talked to her, had bought one of the flowers. Those flowers were not from the mansion's garden. They were different, simpler, planted in makeshift containers. But Walter didn't want to listen. He had created his own truth and was convinced of it. George, the gatekeeper, had also seen part of the scene. He was at his post in the gatehouse when he heard the shouts and saw Walter storm out. He saw the girl crying, saw the flowers on the ground, but did nothing. Later, when Walter passed him on his way back to the garden, George asked what had happened. Walter repeated the same story. The girl was stealing flowers, he had dealt with her, and now she wouldn't be back. George shook his head, bothered, but he too said nothing. It wasn't his business. Or at least that's what he told himself, trying to ease his conscience. Brenda, the housekeeper, arrived for work a few hours later. When she entered the kitchen, Mrs. Rose was quiet, stirring a pot with more force than necessary. Brenda sensed something was wrong. "What is it, Rose? You look upset." Mrs. Rose sighed deeply and told her everything. She told her about the girl who came to sell flowers on the sidewalk, about Walter kicking her box and humiliating the child, about how no one had done anything to help. Brenda listened, her face growing grimmer. When Mrs. Rose finished, the housekeeper shook her head in anger. "That's not right, Rose. A child that small, working to help her family, and this man does something like that. What a heart of stone." "I know, Brenda, I know. But what can we do?" "Walter said she was stealing the flowers," Mrs. Rose replied, but her voice trembled. It was clear she didn't believe it herself. "Stealing?" Brenda let out a bitter laugh. "That girl doesn't steal anything. I've bought flowers from her twice. They're simple flowers, planted in old cans. Anyone can see they're not flowers from a rich person's garden. Walter made that up in his head because he can't stand to see poor people near the mansion. He's disgusted by the poor." The two women were silent for a moment, each lost in her own thoughts. They knew what had happened was unjust, but they also knew they were in a delicate position. They were employees, dependent on that job to survive, and confronting Walter or questioning his actions in front of their boss could have consequences. So, like so many others that morning, they chose silence. A heavy silence laden with guilt and helplessness. If you were in Mrs. Rose's or Brenda's shoes, would you have confronted Walter in that moment, or would you have remained silent? Let us know in the comments. Meanwhile, Isabella was on the bus heading home. She held the battered box on her lap, looking at the few flowers she had managed to save. The tears had dried, but her eyes were still red and swollen. She tried to understand what she had done wrong. Why had that man been so cruel? Why hadn't he believed her? Why hadn't anyone helped? The girl remembered her grandmother's words, "Kindness blossoms where you least expect it," but today she hadn't seen kindness blossom. Today she had seen the opposite. She had seen cruelty, injustice, indifference. She had seen that people aren't always good, that the truth doesn't always matter, and that sometimes you can do everything right and still be treated as if you were wrong. When she got home, Grandma Mary was sitting in the living room chair, a blanket over her legs despite the warmth. Her grandmother realized immediately that something was wrong. "My little one, what happened? Why do you look like that? And where are the flowers?" Isabella couldn't hold it in. She fell into her grandmother's arms and cried. She cried out everything she had held back on the bus, everything she had tried to swallow on the sidewalk. She told her about the man who yelled at her, who called her a thief, who destroyed her flowers. She told her that no one helped, that everyone just looked and walked away. She told her that she tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. Grandma Mary hugged her granddaughter with all the strength she had left in her ailing body. She felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. She knew how much those flowers meant to Isabella. She knew how hard the girl worked to care for them, how dedicated she was, how much she dreamed of helping her family. And to know that someone had destroyed all that and on top of it, had accused her granddaughter of theft, was too much to bear. "My child, listen to Grandma." Grandma Mary held Isabella's face in her hands, forcing the girl to look into her eyes. "There are people in this world who are so full of bitterness inside that they can't see the good in others. That man who did this to you doesn't know you, doesn't know your heart, doesn't know anything. He judged you because he's used to judging, but that doesn't make you any less. Do you understand? You are still my brave, hard-working little granddaughter, full of light. And the flowers will grow again. We'll plant them again. You can always start over." "But Grandma, he called me a thief," Isabella sobbed. "He said he'd have me arrested if I go back there. What now? How will we get the money for the medicine?" Grandma Mary took a deep breath. "God will provide, my child. Always does. You don't have to go back to that place. We'll find another one. And about the medicine, we'll manage. I don't want you going through that again." That night, when Frances arrived home after another long day of hard work as a cleaner, she found her daughter too quiet. Isabella was sitting in the backyard, looking at the remaining plants, but without that sparkle in her eyes. Frances talked to Grandma Mary, who told her everything that had happened. Isabella's mother felt a surge of anger in her chest, a desire to go to that mansion and give that arrogant gardener a piece of her mind. But she knew it would be pointless. People like Walter don't listen to people like her. To them, the poor have no voice, no reason, no rights. Frances sat next to her daughter and stroked her hair. "My little one, I know today was hard, but you are strong, stronger than that mean man will ever be in his entire life. And you know why? Because you have love in your heart. You plant flowers to bring joy to people. That is greater than any wickedness." Isabella looked at her mother with eyes still wet. "But Mom, we need money. What are we going to do?" "We'll find a way. We always have, and we always will," Frances replied, trying to sound more confident than she really was. "You don't need to worry about that. You're a child. Your job is to study and play, not to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." But Isabella knew things weren't that simple. She saw her mother come home exhausted every day. She saw the bills piling up on the small living room table. She saw her grandmother taking less medicine than she should because there wasn't enough money to buy the whole box. Isabella knew she wasn't just a child. She was part of the machinery that kept that family standing. And now, one of her ways of helping had been destroyed. The days that followed were strange. Isabella went back to school, but she was different, quieter, more withdrawn. The teachers noticed but didn't ask. They thought it was just a phase. The other children noticed too, but they were soon distracted by games and forgot. No one really paid attention. No one saw beneath the surface. At home, Isabella tried to care for the remaining plants, but she no longer had the same enthusiasm. Every time she looked at them, she remembered the box flying, the flowers scattering, the man shouting. The memory hurt like a wound that wouldn't heal. Grandma Mary noticed, and her heart ached along with her granddaughters. Frances noticed and felt helpless for not being able to protect her daughter from all the cruelties of the world. Meanwhile, at the mansion, life went on as if nothing had happened. Walter continued to care for the garden with the same rigor as always, convinced he had done the right thing. Mrs. Rose and Brenda spoke quietly about the incident, always when Walter wasn't around, but they never had the courage to do more than gossip. George tried not to think about it too much, but every now and then the image of the crying girl would return to his mind and bother him. What none of them knew was that the owner of the mansion, Robert Miller, was about to return from a business trip. He had spent 2 weeks handling matters in New York City and was exhausted. The only thing he wanted was to get home, take a shower, and sleep. He had no idea that in his absence, something had happened right in front of his gate. Something that, when he found out, would change everything. It would make him see truths he had been avoiding for years. It would call into question the trust he placed in the people around him. And most importantly, it would make him remember who he really was before grief took over his life. The car bringing Robert back would soon be turning onto that street. And when it did, the story of that girl, the gardener, the mansion, and everyone involved would take a completely different turn. Because sometimes all it takes is the right person looking at the right moment for the truth to finally come to light. 4 days had passed since the incident, 4 days in which Isabella had not returned to that sidewalk, 4 days in which she tried to find other places to sell her flowers, but without success. The people in her neighborhood didn't have money to spare for flowers, and the other affluent neighborhoods were too far away. The girl had tried selling at the school gate in the local park, even in front of the church on Sundays, but sales were few, almost none. People would pass by, look, sometimes offer a compliment, but rarely buy. At home, the situation was getting harder. Her grandmother's medicine had run out, and Grandma Mary was getting worse. The cough returned with a vengeance, and she could barely get out of bed. Frances had managed to get a few days of work at a family's house, but payment wouldn't come until the end of the week, and the rent was already late. The landlord had shown up at the door asking for the money, and Frances had begged for a few more days. The man grumbled, but gave her another week's grace. Just one. On Thursday night, Isabella was sitting in the backyard looking at her plants when Grandma Mary appeared at the door, leaning on the frame because she didn't even have the strength to stand on her own. Her grandmother called her granddaughter in a whisper. "My child, come here for a moment." Isabella ran to her. "Grandma, you shouldn't be on your feet. Go back to bed." But Grandma Mary shook her head, took her granddaughter's hand and looked deep into her eyes. "Listen to me, Bella. I know you're scared to go back to that place, and I understand, but I also know that you are brave, braver than I ever was, and sometimes we need to go back to the very place that hurt us, not to suffer again, but to show that we don't give up, that we don't let the wickedness of others extinguish the light we have inside. Do you understand what Grandma is saying?" Isabella felt a lump in her throat. "But what if he does it again, Grandma? What if he yells at me again and breaks my flowers? Then you hold your head high and come home." "But at least you tried," Grandma Mary said, stroking her granddaughter's face. "You know what I think? I think that man was having a bad day. People do terrible things when they're full of anger inside. But that doesn't mean he'll do it again. And even if he does, my little one, you are not what he says you are. You are what your heart knows you are." That night, Isabella barely slept. She tossed and turned in bed, thinking, pondering. Should she go back? Was it worth the risk? But then she heard her grandmother coughing in the next room, that dry, painful cough, and the decision became clear. She had to try. She had to go back. Not for pride, not out of stubbornness, but because at home there were people who depended on her. On Friday morning, Isabella woke before the sun. She went to the backyard and chose the last flowers that were beautiful enough to sell. There weren't many, maybe 6 or 7 small pots. But it was what she had. She arranged everything carefully in the box, now repaired with duct tape where the cardboard had torn. She put on her school uniform, grabbed her backpack, and before leaving, she passed by the room where her grandmother was sleeping. Grandma Mary was awake, and they looked at each other. Her grandmother smiled, a weak smile, but one filled with pride and love. Isabella smiled back, took a deep breath, and left. What Isabella didn't know was that, at that exact moment, on the other side of the city, Robert Miller was in his car, returning from New York City. He had left at dawn to avoid the heavy traffic and was too tired to talk. His driver, a trusted man who had worked for him for years, drove in silence, respecting his boss's mood. Robert looked out the dark, tinted window, watching the city go by but without really seeing anything. His mind was far away, caught up in meetings, numbers, contracts. When the car turned onto Maple Drive, the street where the mansion was, Robert felt an even greater weariness. He was home, but it didn't feel like home. It was just the place where he slept when he wasn't traveling. The mansion that was once full of life, of laughter, of music, was now a silent mausoleum of memories. Robert had thought about selling it several times, but never had the courage. To sell would be to admit that Olivia was truly gone. It would be closing a chapter he wasn't ready to close. The car slowed as it approached the gate. Robert looked through the window and saw something that made him frown. There was someone on the sidewalk, a child, a small girl in a school uniform with a cardboard box at her feet. She was carefully arranging something inside the box, as if they were very precious things. "Mark, stop the car here a little before the gate," Robert asked his driver, who immediately obeyed, parking a few yards from the entrance. "Is something wrong, sir?" Mark asked, concerned. "No, everything's fine. I just want to watch something," Robert replied, without taking his eyes off the girl. There was something about that scene that intrigued him. What was such a small child doing alone on the street, with a box at that time of the morning? It was then that Walter appeared. The gardener had seen the girl from the window of the tool shed and had decided he would not allow her to return. He crossed the garden with long strides, opened the gate with a bang, and headed toward Isabella. Robert saw everything from inside the car. He saw the expression on his employee's face. He saw the anger, the arrogance, the certainty of someone about to do something they considered just. "You again?" Walter shouted, making Isabella jump in fright. "Didn't I warn you that if you came back here I would call the police? Didn't I tell you not to show your face again?" Isabella backed away, feeling the fear rush back. Her heart raced, and she clutched the box to her chest, as if it were a shield. "Sir, Please, I just need to sell a few flowers. I haven't done anything wrong. Haven't done anything wrong. You steal flowers from the garden and say you haven't done anything wrong. Walter took another step forward, and Isabella retreated another. You're a shameless little thief. Inside the car, Robert felt something churn in his chest. This wasn't right. There was something deeply wrong with this scene. A grown man yelling at a child, intimidating, threatening. Robert looked at the girl. She was trembling, but she wasn't running. She was trying to explain herself, her voice small but firm. I'm not a thief, sir. I grew these flowers at home. Look here. Isabella lowered the box and took out one of the small pots. This is a formula can. I planted the seed that Mrs. Peterson gave me. See? There's nothing like it in your garden. Walter barely glanced at it. Liar! All your flowers are stolen from here. He raised his arm, and for a second it looked like he was going to hit the girl. Isabella closed her eyes, shrinking back, waiting for the blow, but the blow never came. Instead, a deep, calm voice, laden with authority, spoke. Walter. The gardener froze. He knew that voice. He turned slowly and saw Robert getting out of the car, walking toward them. His boss's face was serious, impenetrable. Walter felt his blood run cold. What am I doing here? He thought desperately. How do I explain this? Mr. Miller, you're back. Walter tried to smile, but the smile came out crooked, false. I was dealing with a situation here. This girl, she's been coming here to steal flowers from the garden, and I was explaining that that's not allowed. Robert didn't answer. He walked past Walter and went straight to Isabella. The girl was huddled, her arms wrapped around the box, her eyes wide, with fear. Robert crouched down, getting on her level. He looked at her carefully, really looked in a way few people did. He saw the worn but clean uniform. He saw the old but polished shoes. He saw the small calloused hands, with dirt under the fingernails. He saw the frightened face, but he also saw something more. Dignity. What's your name? Robert asked, his voice low and gentle. Isabella, sir, the girl answered, almost in a whisper. And where do these flowers come from, Isabella? Robert picked up one of the small pots and examined it carefully. It was a formula can with holes in the bottom for drainage, filled with soil and sprouting a small yellow daisy. It was simple, rustic, but there was care in it. There was love. I grow them at home, sir, Isabella said, gaining a little courage. My grandma taught me. We use old cans, tubs, bottles. I got the seeds from Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor, and some I found at the market from things they were going to throw away. I take care of them every day, and when they grow, I sell them to help my mom and buy my grandma's medicine. Robert listened to everything, still holding the small pot. He looked around and saw more pots in the box, all made from repurposed materials. None of them were like the sophisticated pots in the mansion's garden. He turned to Walter, who stood a few feet away, sweating coldly. Were these flowers stolen from our garden? Walter hesitated. He realized too late that he had made a mistake, but he couldn't back down now. He couldn't admit he had judged wrong. His pride wouldn't allow it. Sir, I'm sure they were. I mean, some of these species are in our garden. Daisies, carnations, geraniums. It's quite a coincidence, don't you think? It's not a coincidence, Walter. They're common flowers. Anyone can grow them, Robert said. And there was something in his voice, a tone of disappointment, that made Walter shrink. Do you have any proof that she stole them? Well, I saw her here on the sidewalk several times, always with flowers, and I thought she must be taking them from the garden. I was protecting the property, sir. Walter tried to justify, but his words sounded weak even to himself. Did you see her enter the garden? Did you see her picking the flowers? Robert insisted. I didn't see her directly, but... So you accused her without proof. You destroyed her work without being sure, Robert said, and the silence that followed was heavy. Walter lowered his head, not knowing what to say. Robert turned back to Isabella. The girl's eyes were full of tears, but not of fear. It was relief. Someone had finally believed her. Someone had listened to her side. Someone had truly looked and seen the truth. Isabella, do you have anything else to show me? Something to prove that these flowers Are yours? Isabella remembered. With trembling hands, she reached into the pocket of her uniform skirt and took out a crumpled piece of paper, carefully folded. It was an old note, yellowed with time. I found this, sir. I found it in a pot that was on the sidewalk here a few weeks ago. It had been thrown in the trash, but the paper was with it. My grandma read it to me, because I'm still learning to read properly. And since that day, I decided I would sell flowers to bring hope to people, just like it says here. Robert took the paper carefully. He unfolded it slowly, and when he saw what was written, he felt the world stop. It was Olivia's handwriting, unmistakable, delicate, slanted, full of flourishes, the same handwriting that was on hundreds of cards, notes, and letters he kept in a box in his bedroom closet. And the message, those words, were exactly the kind of thing Olivia would say. If these flowers are in the hands of someone who needs hope, my garden will have fulfilled its mission. Robert felt his throat tighten. His eyes burned, and he had to take a deep breath to keep from breaking down right there. Olivia, this was hers, it had to be. But how? When had she written this? Why had he never seen it? He turned the paper over and saw a date written in pencil in the corner. March 2021. 2 months before she passed. She was already sick, already knew her time was running out, and yet she had thought to leave messages of hope for people she would never meet. Robert held the note to his chest, feeling a wave of emotions he had suppressed for years, pain, longing, love, regret, but also something new, a calling, as if Olivia were speaking to him through that piece of paper, as if she were saying, "Don't close your eyes to the world. Don't build walls so high they prevent you from seeing who is on the other side. The garden is not just to be admired, it is to be shared." "Mr. Miller," Isabella asked, her voice quiet, "are you okay?" Robert blinked, returning to the present. He looked at the girl, at this small child who had carried that message without knowing how much it meant. "I am, Isabella, I'm okay, and You know something? This note was written by my wife. She was the lady of this house, and she loved flowers. She loved giving flowers to people." Isabella's eyes widened. "So you know who wrote this?" "I did. She was the kindest person I ever knew," Robert said, his voice faltering slightly. "And she would be very happy to know that her words reached you, and that you understood exactly what she meant." Isabella smiled, a small but genuine smile, filled with immense relief. "So I'm not a thief, right, sir?" "No, Isabella, you are not a thief. You are a hard-working, brave and bright little girl," Robert said, and turned to Walter. The gardener was standing in the same spot, pale, realizing that everything had fallen apart. "Walter, we need to talk. Inside the house. Now." Walter swallowed hard and followed Robert toward the gate. Before entering, Robert turned one last time to Isabella. "You can stay here and sell your flowers whenever you want, okay? And if anyone bothers you again, you come find me. You can knock on this gate and ask to speak with me. My name is Robert." "Thank you, Mr. Robert," Isabella said, her heart lighter than it had been in days. Robert entered the mansion with Walter behind him. Mark, the driver, had seen everything from a distance and was impressed. He had never seen his boss like that, so involved, so emotional. Mrs. Rose and Brenda, who had heard the commotion, were peeking from the kitchen window and had also seen everything. They exchanged a look of relief. Finally, someone had done the right thing. Inside the mansion's office, Robert asked Walter to sit down. The gardener obeyed, nervously wringing his hands in his lap. "Sir, I can explain." "You can. And you will," Robert interrupted him, sitting behind the large wooden desk. "But before you speak, I want you to understand something. That girl didn't steal anything. You accused her without proof, humiliated her, destroyed her work. Why did you do that, Walter? Out of pride, out of fear? Because you thought that, being poor, she had no right to be on our sidewalk?" Walter remained silent. He didn't know how to answer without incriminating himself further. "You've worked for me for years, Walter, and I've always trusted you to take care of the garden, but taking care of the garden doesn't give you the right to judge and condemn those who pass by," Robert continued, his voice firm, controlled, but laden with disappointment. "My wife, Olivia, built that garden with love. She chose every plant, every flower, thinking of bringing beauty not only into the house, but to those who passed by on the street and looked over the wall. And now I find out that you, who should be honoring that legacy, are using the garden as an excuse to mistreat a child. This disappoints me deeply, Walter, deeply." The gardener felt his throat tighten. He realized he might have lost more than just the argument in this situation. He might have also lost his boss's respect. And more importantly, he might have lost himself along the way. When had he become this bitter, suspicious man, capable of being cruel to a child? How had he reached this point? Robert left Walter in the office for a few minutes, asking him to reflect on his actions, while he himself needed a moment to process everything that had happened. The businessman went up to the bedroom he had once shared with Olivia and went to the closet. At the back, in a shoebox wrapped in tissue paper, were the letters, the notes, the cards she had left. He opened the box carefully, as he always did, and began to look. There were dozens of them. Messages of love, daily notes, shopping lists with hearts drawn in the margin, and then he found it. More notes like the one Isabella had. Several. All with similar messages, all dated from the last months of Olivia's life. One of them read, "May these flowers be the hug I couldn't give." Another, "Beauty is not a luxury, it is a necessity of the soul." One more, "If someone smiles because of this flower, my day will have been worthwhile." Robert realized that Olivia had written these notes with the intention of placing them with flowers she wanted to distribute. It was a project of hers, something she had planned but perhaps hadn't had time to complete. Or perhaps she had completed it in a different way than she imagined, because here was a girl, years later, carrying that message forward. Robert felt tears stream down his face. He had spent years trying to keep everything as it was, preserving the house like a museum, keeping the garden perfect, as if freezing everything in time could bring Olivia back. But she wouldn't have wanted that. Olivia wanted the garden to live, for the flowers to reach those who needed them, for beauty to be shared. And he had failed her. He had let grief turn him into someone distant, closed off, unable to see beyond the walls of his own pain. But maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still time to change, to honor Olivia in the right way, not by preserving everything as it was, but by allowing things to live, to grow, to transform, just as she would have wanted. Robert wiped his tears, put the notes back in the box and went downstairs. He returned to the office, where Walter was waiting with his head bowed. The gardener looked up as his boss entered and saw something different in Robert's face. It wasn't just anger or disappointment. It was a mix of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. "Walter," Robert began, sitting down again, "I'm going to give you a choice. You can continue working here, but you will need to change, truly change. Acknowledge that you were wrong, apologize to that girl, and learn to see people with different eyes. Or you can leave now with a letter of recommendation and 3 months severance pay. The choice is yours." Walter was silent for a long moment. He was used to controlling everything, to being right, to not admitting mistakes. But here he was at a crossroads. He could continue being who he had been, proud and stubborn, and lose everything. Or he could swallow his pride, admit he was wrong, and perhaps learn to be a better person. It was a difficult decision because it meant looking inside himself and facing things he had avoided his whole life. "I want to stay, sir," Walter said finally, his voice low, "and I know I need to change. I know what I did was wrong. I was so afraid of losing my place here, of not being good enough, that I started seeing threats where there were none. And I ended up becoming someone I didn't want to be." Robert nodded. "Fear makes us do terrible things, Walter. I understand that better than you can imagine. But the difference between being a good man and not being one is what you do after you recognize your mistake. You will apologize to Isabella. You will look that girl in the eyes and tell her you were wrong, and you will learn to treat people with the respect they deserve, regardless of where they come from or what they have." "Yes, sir, I will do that," Walter promised, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something like genuine shame. Shame for what he had done, for who he had become. Meanwhile, outside, Isabella had remained on the sidewalk, still processing everything that had happened. The rich man had believed her. He had defended her. He had even said she could come back whenever she wanted. It was hard to believe. It felt like a dream. But it wasn't. It was real. And for the first time in days, Isabella felt that maybe the world wasn't such a bad place after all. Maybe there was still goodness, justice, people willing to listen to the truth. A few people stopped to buy flowers that morning. A woman on her way to the gym bought a small pot of violets. A young man walking his dog took a succulent, and each sale, no matter how small, filled Isabella's heart with renewed hope. By the time she had to leave for school, she had sold 4 pots. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a portion of her grandmother's medicine. In the days that followed, things began to change at the mansion and in the lives of everyone involved. Robert, who had spent years avoiding his own home, started spending more time there. He had long conversations with Mrs. Rose, with George, with Brenda. He wanted to know how they were, what they thought, what they felt. For the first time he truly saw them as people, not just employees. And what he discovered surprised him. Mrs. Rose had a daughter studying to be a veterinarian. George played the guitar and dreamed of starting a band. Brenda wrote poetry in her spare time and had notebooks full of verses tucked away in a drawer. All these people had lives, dreams, stories, and he had spent years not noticing. Robert also wanted to get to know Isabella better. He asked his driver to find out where she lived, and one Saturday afternoon he went there. The house was humble, as he expected, but when he knocked on the door and was greeted by Frances, Isabella's mother, he was met with a dignity and kindness that touched him deeply. Frances was surprised and even suspicious at first. Why was a rich man like him there? But Robert explained that he wanted to meet the family of the girl who had touched his heart, who had brought back a part of him he thought he had lost. Grandma Mary, though ill, insisted on getting up to welcome the visitor. Robert sat in the simple chair in the small living room and talked with them. He heard about their struggles, their dreams, their daily fight to survive, and the more he listened, the more he realized how disconnected he had become from people's reality. He lived in a world of luxury, where problems were solved with money, where difficulties were abstract. But here in this house everything was concrete. The late rent, the medicine that ran out before the salary came in, the food that had to be stretched to last the week. Before leaving, Robert left an envelope with money. Frances tried to refuse, saying she didn't want charity, but Robert insisted. "It's not charity, Frances, it's gratitude. Your daughter gave me something money can't buy. She reminded me of who I was, of who I want to be again. That is priceless. Let me at least help with Grandma Mary's medicine and the overdue rent." Frances accepted, her eyes filled with tears. It was the first time in a long time that someone had looked at her and her family, not with pity, but with genuine respect. And that made all the difference. Robert also decided to make changes at the mansion. He called Walter for a conversation and proposed something unusual. "I want you to set aside a part of the garden and turn it into a small community nursery, a place where people like Isabella can come for seedlings, seeds, to learn how to plant. I want the garden that Olivia built to be shared, for it to fulfill the mission she always wanted it to fulfill." Walter, who had spent the last few days reflecting on his actions, agreed. He knew this meant giving up some of the control he valued so much, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. And surprisingly, the idea even excited him. Perhaps there was something gratifying in teaching others to care for plants, in seeing the knowledge he had being shared, in being part of something bigger than just maintaining a beautiful garden. The gardener also kept his word. One morning, when Isabella arrived to sell her flowers, Walter was waiting. The girl tensed up when she saw him, but he held up his hands in a sign of peace. "Isabella, I need to apologize to you. What I did was wrong, very wrong. I accused you without proof, I destroyed your work, I treated you badly. And there's no excuse for it. I was afraid of losing my job, afraid of not being good enough, and I ended up taking it out on you. But none of that justifies what I did. You didn't deserve it. And I am sorry. Truly sorry." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. She could see that he was being sincere. There was genuine remorse in his eyes. And she, who had a heart too big to hold a grudge, replied, "I forgive you, Mr. Walter. My grandma always says that everyone deserves a second chance, and that we only grow when we admit we were wrong. Walter felt an immense relief. He didn't deserve that forgiveness, but there it was, being offered by a child he had hurt, and that touched him more deeply than any punishment ever could have. The weeks passed, and life began to take new directions for everyone. The community nursery was opened, and people from the community started showing up. Walter, who was once rigid and controlling, discovered that he enjoyed teaching. He liked seeing people learn to plant, to care, to make things grow. And the more he taught, the more he learned himself. He learned about patience, about kindness, about the beauty of sharing instead of keeping things to himself. Grandma Mary received proper treatment thanks to Robert's help, who not only paid for the medicines but also arranged for consultations with specialists. The old woman's health improved considerably, and she regained the energy to tend the backyard with Isabella. The two, grandmother and granddaughter, planted together every afternoon, and those moments became even more precious. Francis got a full-time job at one of Robert's stores. He had been so impressed with the dignity and strength of that woman that he decided to give her an opportunity. Francis proved to be a dedicated and competent employee, and for the first time in years, she could sleep peacefully knowing there was a steady paycheck at the end of the month. Isabella continued to sell her flowers, but now with everyone's support. Robert even suggested she set up a proper little stall on the sidewalk, but the girl preferred to stick with her cardboard box. It was her way, simple and true, and people began to specifically look for her. The flower girl, as she became known in the neighborhood. Her flowers were simple, but they came with a genuine smile and a story of resilience that touched people's hearts. Mrs. Rose, George, and Brenda also felt more valued. Robert began to treat them not as subordinates, but as part of an extended family. He asked about their lives, supported their dreams, created opportunities. The mansion, once cold and silent, began to have life again, not in the same way it had when Olivia was alive, but in a new way, a way that honored her memory by allowing life to continue, things to change, and love to spread. Robert changed too. He started spending less time traveling and more time being present. He reopened some rooms in the house that had been closed off. He started having friends over again. And, most importantly, he began to allow himself to live again. Not forgetting Olivia, never forgetting, but allowing life to move forward, allowing the pain to transform into gratitude for the good memories instead of a weight that chained him to the past. One Sunday afternoon, a few months after it all began, Robert hosted a barbecue in the mansion's garden. He invited all the employees and their families, Isabella with Francis, and Grandma Mary, and the neighbors who frequented the community nursery. The mansion, which had been silent for so long, filled with voices, laughter, music. Children ran through the garden. Adults chatted animatedly. Mrs. Rose prepared her special recipes. George brought his guitar and played for everyone. Robert watched it all from a distance, leaning against the balcony, a smile on his face. He looked at the garden, at the people, at the life happening there, and felt that Olivia was present in some way. Not physically, but in every flower that bloomed, in every smile that spread, in every act of kindness that occurred. She had planted seeds of love and generosity, and now, years later, through the most unlikely people, those seeds were blossoming. Isabella approached him, holding a small pot with a single white rose. "Mr. Robert, I brought this for you. I grew it especially. Grandma said that white roses mean peace and new beginnings, and I thought it was perfect for you." Robert took the small pot, his hands trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Isabella. It's perfect. You know, it was you who taught me that sometimes the most valuable things come in the simplest packages. You, with your flowers in old cans, gave me more than any expensive gift ever could. You gave me back the will to live." Isabella smiled, that pure, luminous smile that was her trademark. "You gave me something important too. You showed me that there are still good people in the world, people who listen, who believe, who help. You gave me hope." The two stood there for a moment, in silence, looking out at the garden full of life. And in that instant, they both understood something profound, that true wealth is not in how much you have, but in how much you are able to give. that the walls we build to protect ourselves sometimes only serve to isolate us, and that kindness, when it finds someone ready to receive it, can transform everything. Walter, who was on the other side of the garden helping some children plant seeds, looked over at Robert and Isabella and felt an unexpected gratitude. He had almost destroyed something beautiful because of his own fear and pride. But he had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. He was learning day by day that control is not the same as care, that perfection is not as important as purpose, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not keeping everything exactly as it is, but allowing things to grow and change. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, people began to say their goodbyes. Frances thanked Robert once more, with tears in her eyes, for everything he had done for their family. Grandma Mary, stronger and healthier than she had been in years, hugged Robert and whispered in his ear, "Your wife would be very proud of the man you've become again." Isabella was the last to leave. Before passing through the gate, she turned and waved to Robert, who waved back. And in that simple gesture, there was a silent promise. The promise that this story didn't end here, that this was just the beginning of something bigger, of an unlikely friendship, of a transformation that would continue to unfold, of flowers that would continue to be planted, sold, shared, spreading beauty and hope wherever they went. That night, Robert went up to his room, opened the box with Olivia's notes, and read them all, again. But this time, instead of pain, he felt peace. He felt that he had finally understood what she wanted, that he had honored her memory in the right way, not by preserving everything like an untouchable museum, but by allowing the love she had planted to continue growing, spreading, touching lives. He took one of the notes, the one that said, "Beauty also feeds the soul," and placed it in a frame. He hung it on his office wall, where he could see it every day. A constant reminder that life is made of choices, that we can choose to build walls or bridges, that we can choose to judge or to understand, that we can choose to keep for ourselves or to share with the world. And Robert had made his choice. He had chosen to open the gates. He had chosen to listen. He had chosen to believe. And that choice had changed not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Because sometimes all we need to transform the world is to be willing to truly look at a child with a box of flowers and see in her not a threat or a nuisance, but an opportunity to be better. The story of Isabella and her flowers became known in the neighborhood. People began to talk about the girl who planted hope in old cans, about the businessman who learned to open his heart again, about the gardener who discovered that the greatest beauty lies in sharing, not in controlling, and about a mansion that ceased to be just a beautiful house and became a place where lives were touched and transformed. Because in the end, it doesn't matter the size of the house we live in or the height of the walls we build. What matters is the size of our heart and the height of the dreams we dare to dream. And if there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that kindness blossoms even in the most unlikely places. Hope can be born from the most difficult situations, and that a single person, even a small child with simple flowers, can change the world around them. And so, as the city of Philadelphia continued its frantic routine, with people rushing from one place to another, with problems and joys, with dreams and fears, there was a girl who every morning went out with her cardboard box, planting seeds of kindness in every heart she touched. And there was a man who had learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what truly matters. And there was a garden that finally was fulfilling its true mission, not just to exist, but to make a difference. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Isabella, Robert, and all the characters who crossed their paths has touched your heart. If you were moved by the transformation that a brave child and her simple flowers caused in the lives of so many people, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it when Robert found his wife's note, when Walter apologized, or when Isabella forgave with the generosity that only a pure soul possesses? Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, make us reflect on our own choices, and remind us that there is always time to start over, to change, to be better. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will move and inspire you.